Welcome to the Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you, and welcome to the Not Old Better Show, the Art of Living interview series. I'm Paul Vogelzang. Today, we're taking on a subject that too many of us were taught to fear or to avoid or apologize for: mathematics. But my guest today says math is not just numbers on a chalkboard. It's not just equations, exams, or that little moment of panic when someone asks you to calculate the tip. Math, at its best, is a way of seeing, can help us understand change, choices, arguments, misinformation, uncertainty, relationships, technology, of course, and even the stories we tell ourselves about our own intelligence. Junaid Mubeen is an award-winning author, mathematician, and educator. Junaid Mubeen is the author of Think Like a Mathematician: Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems, as well as Mathematical Intelligence. Junaid Mubeen is a well-known author. He holds a PhD in mathematics from Oxford University and a master's in education from Harvard University, where he studied as a Kennedy Scholar. After years working on innovative learning technologies, he now develops virtual math initiatives for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He has so much to say to our Not Old Better Show audience. All of us are curious about math. We should be. Junaid Mubeen, welcome to the Not Old Better Show. Junaid Mubeen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to talk to you. Thanks very much for sharing your book, Think Like a Mathematician. I've really enjoyed it. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the simple tools that make complex everyday problems easier to consider. And I definitely want to get into the math part of it, because I think that's a really special thing. And I think today math is just so important. But I also want to ask you about the human element in this, because you've been in lots of very lofty educational spaces, Oxford, Harvard, educational technology, but your work now is really about making math a lot more open, a lot more democratic, perhaps is a term, especially more available to students who may not have had every advantage on it. So when was it that math stopped being kind of this private intellectual pursuit for you and became this kind of public mission? I'll use that phrase to describe it.
I think I've always been driven by that sense of mission, because I come from a very humble background. I come from a working class background. My mum was a stay-at-home mum, and my father worked multiple jobs just to put bread on the table. We weren't impoverished. I don't want to overstate it, but we had a very sort of simple upbringing, and I attended a state school here in the UK. It's what politicians sometimes term in this country as a bog standard state school. It was okay, but it wasn't especially aspirational, and it wasn't particularly usual for students at my school to end up at places like Oxford or Harvard. And so I was always just well aware that I was somewhat of an anomaly, and for my success, there were many others that slipped through the cracks and continue to do so. So I feel I've just been incredibly fortunate, just a number of very fortunate circumstances that have allowed me to undertake one of the most privileged educations. And it's also interesting that the subject that I'm enthralled by, that I ultimately have fallen in love with, is the one that seems most other people have anxieties towards and dare I say loathe. And so that hasn't quite felt right to me either. And here I am, profiting from everything that mathematics has to offer as an intellectual endeavor. My career is built around it now as well. I see its power, I see its beauty, while much of the world has yet to encounter any of that. And so that's never felt right to me. So I've always been driven by that sense of purpose, and mathematics is just a very sort of natural medium through which I can try to level the playing field for others. And so I think my career was always going to end in one of two ways. I was either going to become a professional mathematician, and win the Fields Medal, which is the Nobel Prize in math. And it became very clear very early on that wasn't going to happen. I was very pleased to get a PhD in math, but that was just about my limit. And so the other course was education, and trying to then give something back while also staying connected enough with the subject where I could continue to have fun with it.
Well, we're grateful for your time. We're certainly grateful for the book and all of your research on this subject. You use the word, some you say, dare I say, some people loathe. Perhaps that's true. I think what I often hear, certainly from my audience who've been out of school for decades, they carry around this kind of quiet little sentence, I'm not a math person. Sometimes they kind of chuckle and laugh a little bit about that, but I think they're probably saying it with a little bit of embarrassment. And so I wonder if you maybe talk a little bit about this idea that phrase is probably less about ability and more about identity, and kind of coming up with this kind of self-declaration. And how do we retire it? How do we get rid of that phrase, I am not a math person? Because I
Not a
think,
math person. Yeah.
yeah,
Strange, isn't it? Because we don't hear people say, I'm not a history person,
right.
or even I'm not a science person. There's something very specific about math. And I thought about this for a number of years. I believe it's because there are two brands of mathematics. There's what I call school math, which is, as the name suggests, the math we all get taught in school, which is not a very exciting brand of math, and it's not one that plays to our strength. It's very much predicated on calculation and performing whole reams of calculations with unflinching speed and accuracy. And that's okay. If you happen to enjoy that kind of thing, if you happen to be good with and quick with numbers, then that's all jolly. But that's not really what math is about. That's not what I speak of when I talk about the power and beauty of math. Math is about so much more. It's about patterns. It's about understanding structures. It's about creativity. It's about imagination. And so the math that I have professed my love to is an altogether different brand. And so I think we need to somehow shed mathematics of its baggage, of its association with school math. Now, that's easier said than done, because that's very much then a policy imperative. How do we persuade those people that write our curriculums and assessments that we need to completely overhaul the math curriculum? I think one thing that's happened in the last few years that my previous book touched on is I think people are starting to realize finally, with the advent of artificial intelligence, and I know there's a lot of anxiety around that, but perhaps one silver lining there is that it really should draw a line under the question of whether school math is fit for purpose. It clearly isn't, but in fact, it hasn't been ever since the pocket calculator came along, and maybe even before then. It's never really been fit for purpose because it doesn't promote those creative competencies. And so I almost sort of pursued math in parallel to what I studied at school. And it was only really when I had the opportunity to study math at university that I really got to see what the subject was about. And it's such a shame that that brand of math has to sit on the sidelines as if it's something for gifted and talented students, or it's some kind of enrichment topic that you only do once you've gone through your rite of passage. If I had my way, we would discard so much of the math that students are forced to endure at school and replace it with this very different brand of math. So when people say I'm not a math person, it's not for me to dispute that, but I take it to mean that they just had very negative experiences with this very tiny sliver of the subject. And I'm with them. I don't think that's a particularly exciting brand at all. And I feel like the opportunity is to show them that there is this whole other brand of math out there that takes on so many flavors.
Of course, your new book, Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems. Thank you again for sharing it with me. It's just wonderful. And as I was looking through the book initially, just prior to reading it, I noticed this kind of amazing table of contents that you've written. It reads almost like this kind of, very math-oriented subject matter that it references. titles like the continuum, gradients, relations, sets, axioms, logic, combinatorics, I think I'm pronouncing that right, dimensionality. Those don't really sound so much like simple tools to help us. They sound a lot more complicated. So I think if each one of those chapters, my question for you is this, is if each one of those chapters represents a different tool perhaps on life, which mathematical tool or lens right now do you think we're missing? And why would that one be so important?
Yeah. So um, that list of concepts that you've just gone through there that shapes the book, they're very abstract areas of math, and I wanted to push myself to write that version of this book. There's another version, I'm sure, that could be written that's just a lot more intuitive. If we want to show people that math is useful in the real world, there are many ways to do that in terms of showing its practical application. I wanted to really dig into the abstraction and these so-called pure elements of the subject. You're asking me it's like asking me to choose between my children to choose the chapter.
Okay.
But the chapter I'll reference is the one on gradients, and I think we all have a concept of gradients. That's one of the sort of less abstract ideas. Just this idea that you can measure the rate of things, the rate of change of things, and then if you plot different graphs, you can measure how steep they are at different points. This book is sort of a self-help book, but in many ways it's an antidote to the self-help genre because I've read my fair share of self-help books, and I became tired of them after a while. I felt there were just a few tropes that needed to be challenged, and one of those tropes is just this idea that the route to success is continuous improvement. And there's this famous meme that I quote in the book that seems to come out at the turn of every year, which says, compare the difference. If you just improve your effort by 1% every day, it doesn't seem like much compared to if you drop your effort by 1% per day. But look at how that difference grows over time. So that's paying homage to this idea of exponential growth versus exponential decay, and how these marginal differences compound over time. Um, but the takeaway message from the kind of conventional self help genre is you simply just need to keep improving every single day, and I just feel that's unrealistic. I reflected on this during COVID times, where we could have these bursts of productivity, but there's nothing quite like the pandemic to show us how we could very quickly be knocked out of our stride as well. All it takes is, an illness, or being forced to work from home, or just some, drop in motivation that you can't fully explain. That reminds us that actually life fluctuates. Life goes up and down. It's a very straightforward idea, but it turns out that when you study um, gradients in mathematics, it formalizes these notions. It tells you that actually, you will have to plow through the troughs as well as enjoying the peaks, and you can't really have one without the other. And these are ideas that I studied formally as an undergraduate, and I thought it'd be quite cool to try to take that idea to the masses and say, on the one hand, this is very intuitive stuff. In plain language, we're just saying, what goes up must come down, what goes down must come up, and life ebbs and flows. So not a very profound idea, and yet I felt it was a necessary message because it's the antidote to the self-help genre. And so it was somewhat gratifying to be able to write a chapter that called out a lot of these self-help gurus, and using the tools of gradients just showed how these very sort of intuitive alternatives could actually benefit from more airtime.
I'll share, kind of mine with you, and I related so much to the continuum, this idea that there's this kind of unbroken scale, and you in the book you connect it to rating systems, to pain scales, and the way sometimes digital life often forces us to make some of these very blunt, binary, almost choices. I thought that was so relevant to my audience, those of us who are older adults, because we're often asked to rate our pain, rate our mood. How did you sleep last night on a scale of 1 to 10? Kind of a crude method of arriving that. And so maybe tell us, what's the danger in reducing a very complicated human experience to one number or to a couple numbers?
Yeah, so I think there's two related ideas here. One is the continuum, and then the other is this idea of dimensionality. And I'll try to speak to both at once. So that example of a pain scale, I actually experienced in my youth because I experience and still experience chronic illnesses that bring about bouts of pain. And it was frustrating to be sort of shoehorned into this discrete set of labels to say, your pain is either over here, or it jumps to over here, or over here, and over here. And almost as a gesture, you can have 10 points on that scale rather than 5. So what the continuum does for its part is it says, that there are many contexts where there can never be enough points on that scale to truly pinpoint the sweet spot, whether that's the sweet spot of your pain, or the amount of sugar you want in your tea, or whatever it may be. And there's an even more profound point that I quote from Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, in War and Peace. He refers to these ideas when he's talking about how we evaluate the great events of history. And it's very easy to just point to these very singular causes. Napoleon was responsible for this battle, and nameless president is responsible for that. But what he was trying to portray is this idea that actually we often assign too much credit to lone individuals or lone events, and life is far too complex for that. And in order to be able to evaluate history, we need to take the sum of all the parts, and that means drilling deeper and deeper and deeper. And in fact, his point was that you can never drill deeply enough. All you can do is just sort of keep going and keep probing. And I think it is related to the idea of dimensionality as well, because the moment you're asked to put something on a scale, you're on a line. You're assuming that there's only one spectrum with which to pinpoint this idea. And our political beliefs are often hung this way, aren't they? Where are you on the left to right spectrum? You're either over here, you're over here. And in fact, politics, I think, in many parts of the world is becoming very discrete. And in fact, in many cases, it's becoming binary. But even just this idea of a political spectrum, which we often speak of, even that is very limiting. Or when we talk about our intelligences, what is it? How intelligent are you? Even just granting the premise of that question, how is that measured? Is there this single notion of intelligence that can be captured by a single metric? And so I think mathematics can just offer us a bit of nuance in saying, well, actually, you don't need to settle for one dimension. You can have 2, you can have 3. In fact, you can have any number. You can have infinitely many dimensions if you see fit. And the continuum tells us that within each of those dimensions, you don't need to feel forced to just pinpoint your belief or whatever it is according to a set of discrete labels. But the moment you want to undertake any kind of meaningful analysis of any complex life event, whether that's a geopolitical event, whether it's an event in your personal life, you just have to keep questioning and keep probing and keep looking at all the different variables and factors. And it just reminds us that the complexity often outstrips our ability to analyze it.
I want to ask you about this this fascinating word, combinatorics. I think I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's certainly one of my favorites in the book, and perhaps I had not heard this, and you'll help us understand this much more. But I think for listeners who haven't heard this term, simplified my version, it's a branch of math that kind of deals with combinations, perhaps arrangements, this explosion even of possibilities. And so here's the kind of the everyday version that I kind of came up with for older adults, and that is, perhaps we're comparing health insurance or Medicare options here in this country, a caregiver, maybe organizing or coordinating a bunch of appointments, a family planning trip, or a grandparent, and new grandparent like me, trying to schedule time with a bunch of different people. What is combinatorics, and how can it help us make better decisions amongst all of these combinations when life just gives us almost an infinite possibility?
Yeah, so combinatorics is essentially the study of combinations. It's how many ways can you arrange this? How many different selections can you make? And you can take innocuous examples like just going to an ice cream parlor, and depending on the number of flavors available and the number of scoops of ice cream you're allowed, you can start to just mull over the number of shares of possible ice creams that you can create. And what I think intrigues me by combinatorics as a topic is just how counterintuitive a lot of the results are, and so just how quickly these numbers can grow. So to give another example, imagine if you just have a standard deck of cards, 52 cards, and you give them a random shuffle. Do you know how many ways there are to shuffle a random deck of cards? I mean, what would your intuitions tell you? I'm not asking for a precise number, but roughly, what would you think?
Thousands.
Thousands, right?
Million.
At least
Yeah.
millions, billions. What if I told you
Yeah.
it was actually more than the number of atoms in the universe? Like way
Oh
more.
my gosh.
Not even comparable.
Yeah.
And it's essentially
Incredible.
because you have 52 choices for the card you choose first. For each of
Hmm.
those 52 choices, you have 51 choices and then 50 choices. So the way that calculation works out is it ends up being 52 times 51 times 50 all the way down to 1. And even that may not seem very large. You may know, well, that's going to end up in the millions somewhere. But as I say, it's counterintuitive. It ends up,
Yeah.
ridiculously large, beyond astronomical. And I mean, there's a nice sort of anecdote there, which is, you want to make history right now, take a deck of cards, give it a good shuffle, and almost certainly nobody in the history of humankind will have come up with that very particular arrangement before. So I just think math can also be very entertaining, and sometimes we should just take solace in that. And I love sharing that example with my students. I love handing them a deck of cards and actually getting them to do it in real time. Um, but it also reminds us that there's so much emphasis these days, isn't there, on optimization? Again, going back to the self-help genre, how do you make the perfect choice? And so, if I give another example of where you get a kind of combinatorial explosion, take the game of chess, which actually isn't the most complex game out there, but it's complex enough for our purposes. Play a game of chess, and in the first couple of moves, in the first move alone, you've got how many possible moves? I think there's 20 possible moves. You think about where all the different pawns that can move, the two knights, 20 possible moves that you can do in your first go. Then there's 20 possible moves I can do in response. So just that first pair of moves, we now have 400 possibilities, 20 times 20. And then you can imagine over the span of a game, the number of possibilities, once again, gets into the thousands, the millions, and beyond astronomical figures. And what that tells you right off the bat is that even if you have at your disposal the world's most powerful supercomputer that whose specialty is playing chess, it still won't be able to crunch through every possible combination and figure out how to play the perfect chess game. If there is such thing as a perfect chess game, we're never going to figure out what it is. The number of possibilities is just too large for us to ever actually be able to compute. And I think, on the one hand, that's a very daunting realization, but it can also be liberating. Because if that's true of chess, then it almost certainly is true of our everyday lives. And so, as we're constantly striving to make the best choices, whether it's who to marry or which job to go for next, or whether to go for that promotion, or whether to go for a run today, or to just stay at home and run. There are so many choices we're confronted with, and we have to just remind ourselves that we're constantly confronted with this combinatorial explosion of possibilities, and it doesn't even make sense much of the time to try to figure out what the optimal choice is. And so, just going back to the chess example, what one of the strategies that they'll use is they'll talk about a depth first approach versus a breadth first approach. And the idea of a depth first approach is you look at a very particular route into the game. Maybe you're going to develop your knights in a certain way, and you just explore that strategy very deeply. In the real world, maybe that means just going all in on a particular career trajectory, and just seeing where that takes you. That could lead to the best possible outcome of all possibilities. But the breadth first approach is actually variety is the spice of life. It actually pays to just broaden your horizons, try a bit of this and a bit of this. You're not going to go as deep into any area, but you may just stumble upon an avenue that actually um, uh, gives you a greater profit than all the others. And playing, becoming a chess grandmaster, which I am not, by the way, but chess grandmasters understand that the game is a balance between the two. There are times where you go deep, and there are times where you go broad. And I think that is a very good metaphor from life. And again, a lot of that is underpinned by the math of combinatorics.
You are, of course, listening to the Not Old Better Show. I'm Paul Vogelsang. If you're catching us mid-episode, our guest today is Junaid Mubeen, author of Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems. We have been talking up to now about math, not as a school subject, but as a set of tools for living, tools for seeing nuance, managing complexity, and making better choices. After the break, we'll turn to something deeply important, how these ideas can reach students who have historically been left out of the math conversation, and what technology can and cannot do to close that gap. Stay with us. We will be right back with Junaid Mubeen. Our guest today is author and mathematician Junaid Mubeen. Junaid Mubeen has written the wonderful new book, Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems. The book is excellent. I just can't recommend it enough for our audience. We'll have links in our notes today for more information about Junaid and his work, including direct links to the book. It's getting just some great attention and rave reviews online. I thought this review just really said so much to me, and I know it will to our audience. Maths needs more demystifiers. I like that. And Junaid Mubeen is here to lift back the veil. Eugenia Chang, author of The Art of Logic, said that about your book, Junaid Mubeen, and I just thought that was just such a very relevant assessment and review. Congratulations on all of your work. I want to talk to you for a second about this idea of the virtual classroom, specifically this notion of the equity equation, because you talk about students getting a benefit, perhaps who might have come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think, as I was reading through the book, I certainly, it just jumped out to me that a student who struggles with math might not just miss a lesson. They might start to believe that certain careers might not be available to them. Maybe they have a less of a future, perhaps, that their confidence is shaken about that. And so tell us a little bit about what a virtual math program is, and why does that give a disadvantaged student that traditional classroom feel that you might not get there?
Sure. So my day job at the moment is working on an online education platform. It's called parallel.org.uk. It's a charitable initiative where we look to stretch very bright and very enthusiastic young mathematicians in recognition of the fact that many of these students receiving the diet of mathematics at school, which, at best is giving them a foundation for learning, but isn't really stretching them to their full potential. We felt there was an opportunity to level the playing field by building a curriculum and a structured program of study that would push them as if they went to the most affluent school, so that by the time they're thinking about applying for college, university, or their careers, it's just a given that math is going to feature prominently, because they've been given that space to develop their potential. But much of that is about bringing these students into a safe space where they can discuss math, solve problems in a way where they won't be judged, where the norms of school mathematics are somewhat upended, because in school math, every mistake is punished. It's an indictment of your intelligence somehow. Whereas the kind of math that we do, you're expected to make mistakes. And in fact, developing coping mechanisms for struggle is actually a big part of what it means to become a mathematician. So I think a lot of it is just about teaching them those values, but having the mathematics, the brand of mathematics to back it up. There's another trend, I guess, in online education that I have had some association with in the past that I think is gaining a lot of traction as well, which is AI-based tutoring. Can artificial intelligence now replicate the behavior of a human tutor and somehow equalize the playing field? I think it's an interesting idea, but my general view of AI in any context is it should never be pursued without a human in the loop. And in its best manifestations, I think AI-based tutoring will really strengthen the bond between human teachers and human tutors and their students. And I think it's a dangerous idea, actually, to suggest that we can displace the role of the human teacher, and that somehow AI-based tutors will be the panacea. So I thought I would just mention that as it's a trending topic. But as I say, much of the emphasis for me is just ensuring that students understand that when we talk about mathematics, there's a plurality to that. There's the mathematics they are exposed to at school, but there is this whole other brand out there that's far more recreational, far more puzzly in its nature, and just far more uplifting, and far more forgiving of mistakes. Less focused on speed, less focused on accuracy, and more focused on creativity and imagination. So the more students that can be exposed to that, the better.
The book, again, is wonderful. Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems. Uh, Junaid Mubeen is our guest. I just have one kind of final question for you here, and that has to do with the chapter on distance, because I thought it was one of the most hopeful chapter titles, particularly for my audience of older adults. Titled is Distance, with the subhead Rethinking Proximity and Why Our Life Goals May Be Closer Than We Think. I think that's a very powerful idea, Junaid. Some people in my audience, I'm one. This is kind of a second career for me. Many in our audience are caregiving. Some are grieving. I mentioned my son and daughter-in-law. My daughter-in-law is from Bolivia. I'm trying to learn a new language. I'm trying to learn Spanish as I get a little bit older. So I think that this idea of life goals is a really powerful one. And so how is it that math can help the way we think about this idea of distance, not just the physical distance, but emotional distance, educational distance, and the distance that, is between who we are and who we still hope to become?
Yeah. So again, what math does is it generalizes these everyday notions that we have. So as you say, we think of distance in terms of physical proximity, and even then, it's as the crow flies, is a straight line distance between 2 points. But there are many ways in which you can think of distance. And again, it comes back to this idea of attaching many dimensions to an idea. And so within mathematics, there's a very broad definition of a distance. A distance is anything that behaves as a distance should. So the distance between two objects should be the same, regardless of which direction you're coming from. The distance between an object and itself should be zero. And there are many ways of defining distance in mathematical terms that abide by those axioms. And what this often comes down to is a choice. So if you want to get closer to your life goals, mathematics permits you to do that in different ways. So one way, for instance, is to say, right, here are 5 different life goals that I have. I want to become a better public speaker. I want to become physically fit. I want to have more time for my wife and kids, and so on and so forth. And so one way to approach this idealized version of myself, I can imagine this future version of Junaid somewhere in the distance, somewhere on that horizon. And I can imagine myself approaching that version of Junaid in all of these directions. So I'm going to go to the gym a bit more, and I'm going to try to find more time for my kids. So I guess I'm going to sleep a bit less, and I'm going to take more time to read. So I become more well versed on current affairs. And suddenly those things are intentional with each other because time is short. We have a finite supply of time and energy. And so there are other notions of distance that will actually just as permissible. So one version is the one that says actually just choose one of those things and just go in that direction. Because even if you're compromising on some of those other areas, you're still heading towards that future version of yourself. You're just putting more of your eggs in one basket. So for me right now, I think that will probably mean spending more time with my kids. I will, put a premium on that ahead of some of those other, if that means I'm going to, become slower in my running and get through less books a year, so be it. And so, we're just hopelessly tied with constraints. We can't possibly attack life's problems from all directions. But mathematics reminds us that actually distance is a very general concept, and you can often approach your targets from multiple directions, and you can make these very conscious choices about whether you focus on one particular area or all areas at once. And again, it's that sort of trade-off between breadth and depth that I mentioned earlier with combinatorics and playing chess. And I think there is something to be said for just recognizing that it's a bit of a zero-sum game. That's more of a term from economics, where you just have to accept that you're not going to be able to do everything, and that some things are going to come at the expense of others. But once you accept that, it can actually become quite liberating.
Wonderful. Junaid, thank you so much for joining us today. Just a excellent conversation. Author of this wonderful book, Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems. We'll have links in our notes today to find out more information about Junaid and his work. Just a pleasure talking to you. I know our audience is just going to love this subject, as have I. Please come back. I'll just say that selfishly. As you do more work on this subject and others, you're just a bit of a wonderful guest, great sense of humor, and please think about coming back. We'd love to hear more.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I would love to come back, so I'll wait for the call.
Junaid Mubeen, our guest today, has given us a different way to think about mathematics. Not as a subject locked away in classrooms, not as a test we passed or failed years ago, not as a source of anxiety, embarrassment, or old stories we keep telling ourselves, I'm no good at math, but as a language for life, a way to understand choices, a way to see nuance, a way to question our assumptions, a way to recognize patterns, handle uncertainty, and maybe even become a little more generous in how we judge ourselves and others. Junaid Mubeen's new book, Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems, is wonderful. We will have links so that our audience can find more about Junaid and his work and his new book. But the book reminds us that math is not only about numbers. It's about how we think. It's about how we move through a complicated world with a little more clarity, a little more humility, and a little more wonder. And that matters at every age, because many of us, especially those who were told long ago that we were not math people, certainly me, between mathematicians and poets, I was the poet. This conversation today offers a second chance for all of us, a chance to say, maybe I was never bad at math. Maybe I just never saw what math was really for. Maybe I've been thinking mathematically all along. When we weigh a decision, we're doing math. When we look for patterns in our health, our habits, or our relationships, we are doing math. When we ask better questions before jumping to conclusions, we're doing math. And when we help younger generations discover confidence where they once felt shut out, we are doing something even bigger. For those of us in the Not Old Better Show audience who are grandparents, this is a very big deal. We're opening a door. Junaid Mubeen's work in virtual math learning for disadvantaged students pointed out to us that larger purpose, that education should not be reserved for the already confident, the already resourced, or the already convinced. It should reach the student who doubts themselves, the adult who still carries math anxiety, the curious listener who simply wants better tools for modern life. So here is our invitation today. Retire the phrase, I'm not a math person. Replace it with something better. I'm still learning how to think. That is the sentence that has the room in it to keep learning, that room for curiosity, that room for growth, that room for possibility. My thanks to author Junaid Mubeen today and his wonderful book, Think Like a Mathematician, Simple Tools for Complex Everyday Problems. Thanks for joining us on the Not Old Better Show. I appreciate you being here and listening. Please stay curious, stay engaged, be well. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Remember, sometimes the most powerful tools for changing our lives are not the ones we hold in our hands, but the ones we learn to carry in our minds. Until next time, keep living. Be better on the Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.